Marcus, a respected black judge, was having dinner and enjoying an evening at a restaurant with his family, but it didn't last long. One of the restaurant patrons attacks his family and spits in Marcus's soup. But what McRook did will shock you. Watch till the end so you don't miss this tragic story. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment from where you're watching this video. The evening had started like any other, a rare moment of tranquility for Judge Marcus Reed and his family. As a highly respected black judge, Marcus often found himself consumed by his work, dealing with some of the city's most intense and high-profile cases. But tonight, he was determined to put all of that aside and simply enjoy a peaceful meal with his wife, Evelyn, and their teenage daughter, Sophia. They had chosen a high-end restaurant known for its exclusivity and elegance, a place where the cares of the outside world could seemingly melt away. Seated at a quiet table near the large floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus admired the city lights twinkling outside, momentarily lost in the beauty of it all. Across from him, Evelyn, with her grace and poise, offered him a reassuring smile, while Sophia, their bright and ambitious daughter, chatted excitedly about her upcoming school project. For once, the weight of his profession and the challenges of life as a black man in a predominantly white field felt distant. But that peaceful moment was shattered when a tall, burly man, clearly intoxicated and reeking of arrogance, approached their table. His skin was pale and his face twisted into a sneer as his eyes fell on Marcus and his family. There was something unsettling about the way he hovered near their table, his gaze filled with contempt. Without a word, the man leaned forward and spat directly into Marcus's soup, the thick glob of saliva landing with an audible splash. The act was so brazen, so filled with malice, that for a moment the entire table froze. Evelyn's eyes widened in shock, and Sophia's voice caught in her throat. Marcus, too, felt a moment of disbelief, a wave of anger rising swiftly within him. The restaurant fell eerily silent as nearby patrons turned their heads, watching the scene unfold. It was as if time had stopped, and all eyes were now on Marcus, waiting to see how he would react. His first instinct was to stand up and confront the man, to unleash the fury that was bubbling beneath his composed exterior. How dare this stranger, this man with nothing but hatred in his eyes, violate their peaceful evening with such an act of disrespect? But Marcus knew better. As a judge, he had spent years honing his self-control, navigating situations where he had to remain calm and composed even when his emotions screamed otherwise. He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He glanced at Evelyn and Sophia, both of whom looked at him with worry and fear in their eyes. He couldn't lose control. Not here, not now. "I'll handle this," Marcus muttered quietly to himself, forcing the anger back down into the pit of his stomach. He waved over the waiter, keeping his voice steady even as the tension in his body remained palpable. "Excuse me," he said, his tone controlled. "Could you please replace this soup?" The waiter, visibly nervous, nodded quickly and hurried away, eager to defuse the situation. Marcus could feel the eyes of the other diners on him, some watching with curiosity, others with judgment. They expected a different reaction from him, something louder, angrier, but Marcus was determined to rise above the situation, to maintain his dignity despite the blatant disrespect he had just faced. The burly man, still standing nearby, smirked as he watched Marcus's calm response. Clearly, he had expected more. He had wanted to provoke a scene, to see the black man lose his temper in front of all these well-to-do patrons. When Marcus didn't give him that satisfaction, the man let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as if disappointed by the lack of drama. "Figures," the man muttered under his breath before stumbling back toward his own table, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. Marcus sat back in his chair, his body still taut with the effort of keeping his emotions in check. He could feel Evelyn's hand gently resting on his arm, a silent gesture of comfort. Across from him, Sophia remained quiet, her eyes wide as she tried to process what had just happened. "I'm proud of you," Evelyn whispered softly, her voice filled with admiration. She knew how hard it was for him to stay calm in situations like this, where he was targeted simply because of the color of his skin. "You handled that well." Marcus gave her a small nod, though inside the fire of anger still burned. How many times had he faced moments like this? How many times had he been forced to take the high road while others around him spat their hatred in his face, both literally and metaphorically? It never got easier, and tonight was no different. The minutes passed, and the tension in the room slowly eased. Marcus thought, perhaps foolishly, that the worst of the evening was behind them. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming. The man's eyes, filled with disdain and contempt, had left an impression on him that he couldn't quite forget. As they waited for the waiter to return with a new bowl of soup, Marcus stole a glance at the man who had started all this. The burly figure sat a few tables away, hunched over a drink, his eyes occasionally darting back toward Marcus and his family. It was clear that this man wasn't done, that his hateful act of spitting into the soup was just the beginning. Evelyn, sensing Marcus's unease, squeezed his arm gently. "Don't let him get to you," she whispered. "He's not worth it." "I know," Marcus replied quietly, though the anger inside him still simmered. He had learned over the years to control it, to keep it locked away. But tonight felt different. He could feel that this wasn't over. Sophia, still shaken, looked at her father with concern. "Dad, why did he do that? We didn't do anything wrong." Marcus's heart ached at the innocence in her voice. How could he explain to his daughter the complexities of racism, of hatred that didn't need a reason? He gave her a gentle smile, doing his best to reassure her. "Some people are just filled with hate, Sophia, but it's important that we don't let them control how we feel." Sophia nodded, though the confusion and fear in her eyes remained. Marcus knew that tonight would leave a lasting mark on her, that this incident would stay with her long after they left the restaurant, and for that he felt a deep sense of sadness and frustration. As the waiter finally returned with the replacement soup, Marcus offered a quiet thank you, though the appetite he once had was now gone. The evening had been tainted, the peaceful moment shattered by the actions of one hateful man. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The evening had already taken a bitter turn, but Marcus still hoped they could salvage it. He and his family tried to move on from the earlier incident, pretending the restaurant's elegant atmosphere could somehow wash away the ugliness they had just experienced. Marcus sat silently, spooning his new bowl of soup without much interest, though the tension in his shoulders was impossible to miss. Evelyn, still unsettled but putting on a brave face, glanced at their daughter, Sophia, who was visibly shaken. She whispered soft words of comfort, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair, but even she couldn't fully hide the strain in her voice. The earlier confrontation had rattled them all, yet they were determined not to let one hateful man ruin their evening. They had just started eating again when Marcus felt it, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck, that unmistakable awareness of being watched. Slowly, he lifted his gaze, and there he was. The same burly man glaring from his table across the room, his face twisted with contempt. Marcus's stomach tightened. He knew that look. It wasn't over. Marcus forced himself to focus on his family, ignoring the burning eyes he could feel searing into him from across the restaurant. He was doing his best to stay calm, reminding himself of all the times he had diffused tense situations in the courtroom. But something about this moment was different. This wasn't a legal case. This was personal, direct, and filled with hatred. And there was no judge's bench to shield him from the mess of it all. Before Marcus could say anything, the man stood up from his table, carrying a steaming cup of tea in his hand. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately as patrons' heads turned, sensing that something was about to happen. The man's movements were slow, deliberate, as if he wanted to make sure everyone was watching. Marcus's grip tightened around his spoon. The man approached their table again, but this time there was no smirk, no thinly veiled amusement. His face was set in a sneer of pure hatred, and he marched straight toward Evelyn. In the split second before it happened, Marcus could already sense what was coming, but he couldn't react fast enough. Without a word, the man tipped his cup forward, sending a torrent of scalding hot tea directly onto Evelyn's face. Evelyn let out a heart-wrenching scream as the burning liquid splashed across her skin. Her hands flew to her face in a desperate attempt to wipe away the burning tea, but the damage had already been done. Marcus's world seemed to slow as he watched in horror, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of shock and fury surging through his veins. Sophia gasped, frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror as she looked at her mother. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't move, too stunned to even reach out. In that moment, all of Marcus's control snapped. The anger he had fought so hard to suppress exploded to the surface, fueled by the sight of his wife in agony, her skin already red and blistering from the burn. He didn't think. He couldn't. All he knew was that this man had crossed a line that no man should ever cross. With a sudden, violent movement, Marcus shot up from his chair, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the man who was now backing away, his face filled with a smug sense of satisfaction. But that satisfaction didn't last long. With a single, swift punch, Marcus sent the man crashing to the ground, his body collapsing in a heap on the restaurant floor. The force of the blow knocked the wind out of the man, and a high-pitched yelp escaped his lips as he hit the ground hard. The restaurant erupted in gasps and murmurs, the quiet hum of conversation now replaced by the shocked whispers of onlookers. Marcus stood over the man, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched, his rage barely contained. For a moment, he wanted to hit him again, to make sure the man felt every ounce of pain that Evelyn was feeling. But Marcus forced himself to stop, stepping back and turning his attention to his wife. Evelyn was hunched over in her chair, clutching her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to fight through the searing pain. Her skin was an angry shade of red, the tea having burned deep into her delicate skin. Sophia finally snapped out of her frozen state and rushed to her mother's side, her small hands trembling as she tried to comfort her. "Mom, are you okay? Mom!" Sophia's voice cracked as panic took over. Marcus rushed back to his family, kneeling beside Evelyn and gently pulling her hands away from her face so he could assess the damage. His heart broke at the sight. Evelyn's usually smooth, beautiful skin was now blistered and raw, and she winced at even the lightest touch. "Evelyn, I'm so sorry. "I'm so sorry," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He wanted to fix it, to take away her pain, but there was nothing he could do in that moment except be there for her. The man on the floor groaned, his hand weakly pressing against his bruised jaw as he struggled to sit up. Blood trickled from his lip where Marcus's punch had landed, but the satisfaction of seeing him in pain was overshadowed by the anguish Marcus felt for his wife. "Dad, what's going to happen?" Sophia's voice wavered, her eyes darting nervously between her parents and the fallen man on the floor. "What if he calls the police?" Marcus hadn't thought about that until now. His mind had been consumed with protecting his family, with making sure this man paid for what he had done. But now that Sophia mentioned it, the reality of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. The man had every intention of calling the police, and Marcus knew exactly how that would play out. The police wouldn't care that this man had attacked his wife first. They wouldn't care that Marcus had simply defended his family. All they would see was a black man who had laid hands on a white man, and they wouldn't hesitate to take action against him. Sure enough, as Marcus turned to look at the man, he saw him pulling out his phone, his fingers fumbling over the screen as he dialed for the police. The man's voice was shaky, but it was filled with venom as he spoke into the phone. "I've been attacked," the man shrieked into the receiver, his voice exaggerated and filled with lies. "A black man just assaulted me out of nowhere. I need the police here, now." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The words "black man" hung in the air like a death sentence. He had heard those words weaponized too many times before, used to paint innocent black men as aggressors, as threats. And now those same words were about to be used against him. He looked at Evelyn, still whimpering in pain, her face swollen and burned, and then at Sophia, her eyes wide with fear. He had done the right thing. He had protected his family, but none of that would matter when the police arrived. Marcus swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what was to come crashing down on him. The restaurant was still in chaos when the police arrived. It had been less than 10 minutes since the man had made his call, but in that time, the tension in the air had become suffocating. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of adrenaline and dread coursing through his veins. His mind raced with the possible outcomes, each one more grim than the last. Evelyn was still clutching her face, her skin painfully burned from the scalding tea that had been thrown on her. Sophia sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, trying to keep her mother calm, even though the fear in her own eyes was unmistakable. They hadn't moved from their seats since Marcus had punched the man, but now, as the blue and red lights flashed outside the restaurant's large windows, they all knew things were about to escalate further. The restaurant door swung open, and 2 police officers, both white, both looking stern and unapproachable, strode in. Their eyes immediately swept the room, and within seconds they locked onto Marcus. He could feel it, the way they zeroed in on him as the problem, even without hearing a single word of explanation. The fact that he was black and standing near a white man on the floor seemed to tell them everything they needed to know. The man Marcus had struck, still groaning and cradling his bruised jaw, was quick to seize the moment. He sat up with a dramatic gasp, pointing a shaky finger at Marcus as the officers approached. "That's him!" the man shouted, his voice loud and dripping with false victimhood. "He attacked me. I was just walking by and he hit me for no reason." Marcus clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. He knew what was happening. This man was playing the role of the innocent bystander, twisting the narrative to make it seem like he had been wronged. And the worst part was, Marcus knew the police were going to believe him. The officers turned their attention to Marcus, their expressions hardening as they approached. One of them, Officer Harris, a tall man with a square jaw and a cold gaze, stepped forward, his hand resting on the baton at his belt. "Sir, we're going to need you to step away from him," Harris ordered, his voice flat and authoritative. Marcus raised his hand slightly, a gesture of non-resistance, but his voice was firm as he responded. "I didn't attack him for no reason. He threw scalding hot tea on my wife. She's sitting right there, burned and in pain. I defended her." Harris glanced over at Evelyn, who was still holding her face, her skin red and raw from the burn. Sophia, her daughter, had tears in her eyes, looking back and forth between the officers and her father, silently pleading for them to understand. But Harris's attention barely lingered on them before he turned back to Marcus, his expression unchanged. "That may be," Harris said, his tone dismissive, "but we received a report of an assault, and you match the description of the assailant." Marcus felt a surge of frustration boiling inside him. "He's lying," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "He spat in my food, then threw hot tea at my wife. I only acted to protect my family." The second officer, a shorter man with a bulkier build named Officer Stevens, took a step forward, eyeing Marcus with suspicion. "Sir, we need you to calm down and cooperate," Stevens said, his voice tinged with warning. Marcus's hands remained in the air, but his patience was wearing thin. He was a judge, a man of the law, and he knew exactly how situations like this played out. He had seen it happen to others, read about it in countless cases, but now it was happening to him. Because of the color of his skin, they automatically assumed the worst. "I am calm," Marcus said, doing his best to keep his voice steady. "But you need to listen. I'm not the one who started this. He attacked my wife first. Look at her face. Look at the burns." The officers exchanged a glance, and Harris's grip on his baton tightened slightly. It was clear that they weren't interested in Marcus's side of the story. They had already made up their minds about what had happened. At that moment, the man on the floor, still playing the role of the victim, let out another dramatic groan. "He's dangerous," the man wheezed, clutching his jaw. "I didn't even do anything to him. I was just trying to enjoy my meal, and he attacked me out of nowhere." The officer's expressions hardened further, and Harris turned back to Marcus, his stance shifting to one of aggression. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." "What?" Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're arresting me?" Stevens stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "We're detaining you for assault." "No!" Sophia cried out, jumping up from her seat. "No, my dad didn't do anything wrong. That man hurt my mom. He was just protecting her." Evelyn, despite the pain she was in, tried to speak as well. "Please, listen to my daughter. This man attacked us. Marcus was just defending me." But the officers weren't listening. They had already made their decision. Harris took a step toward Marcus, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "I don't care what your side of the story is, sir. You're coming with us." Marcus felt his anger flare again, but this time it was mixed with something else, fear. Not for himself, but for his family. He couldn't leave them here, not like this. Evelyn needed medical attention, and Sophia was scared out of her mind. They were his responsibility, and he couldn't let these officers tear him away from them over something so unjust. "I'm a judge," Marcus said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I know the law, and I know that you have no grounds to arrest me." The officers exchanged another look, and for a brief moment, Marcus thought maybe, just maybe, they would listen to reason. But then Stephen sneered, shaking his head in disbelief. "A black judge?" he scoffed. "Yeah, right. And I'm the president." Harris chuckled darkly, clearly amused by the idea. "Nice try, buddy, but you're coming with us." Before Marcus could protest further, Harris and Stevens moved in. Their hands were rough as they grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back and slapping the cold metal handcuffs onto his wrists. Marcus winced as the cuffs dug into his skin, but he didn't resist. He knew better than to struggle. He had seen too many cases where things had gone horribly wrong for black men in his position. As they dragged him toward the exit, Marcus caught a glimpse of his wife and daughter. Evelyn was still holding her face, tears streaming down her cheeks from both the pain and the fear. Sophia was sobbing, reaching out for him as if she could somehow pull him back. "Dad," she cried, "Dad, please, don't take him. He didn't do anything wrong." Marcus's heart broke at the sound of his daughter's voice, but he was powerless to do anything. He looked at Evelyn, who met his eyes with a pained expression, and he mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," before the officers yanked him out of the restaurant and into the cold night air. Outside, the police car waited, its lights still flashing. Harris and Stevens shoved Marcus into the back seat without a word, slamming the door behind him. As the car pulled away, Marcus felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. His wife was injured, his daughter terrified, and he was being taken away like a common criminal, all because of one man's hatred and the police's refusal to see the truth. As they drove off, Marcus couldn't help but wonder how things had spiraled so far out of control. He was a man of the law, a judge who had devoted his life to upholding justice. And now, here he was, handcuffed in the back of a police car, treated like a threat simply because of the color of his skin. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on him, but even as the police car sped toward the station, Marcus held on to one small hope. Someone in that restaurant had to have seen what really happened. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that the truth would come out. The ride to the police station was a blur for Marcus. The flashing lights of the police cruiser bounced off the darkened city streets as the car sped through the night. His thoughts, however, were far from the scenery passing by. His mind was filled with a mixture of anger, disbelief, and concern for his wife and daughter, left behind in the restaurant. His hands, still cuffed tightly behind his back, were beginning to go numb, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the storm of emotions raging within him. The officers, Harris and Stevens, said nothing during the drive. The silence in the car was heavy, only broken occasionally by the crackle of the police radio or the sound of traffic passing by. Marcus couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Just an hour ago, he was enjoying a peaceful dinner with his family, and now he was being taken to the station in handcuffs for defending them. As they pulled into the police station parking lot, Marcus felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. He had spent his life on the other side of the law, presiding over cases, making decisions that shaped people's lives. But now, he was the one being treated like a criminal. And as much as he wanted to believe that things would work out, that the truth would prevail, he knew better. Black men didn't get the benefit of the doubt, no matter their status, no matter their achievements. The car came to a stop, and before Marcus could fully collect his thoughts, the door swung open. Officer Harris roughly grabbed his arm, yanking him out of the back seat and onto his feet. Marcus winced as his shoulder twisted awkwardly, but he kept silent. He had no desire to provoke them further. "Let's go," Harris muttered, shoving him toward the station's entrance. The cold night air bit at Marcus's skin as they walked, but the numbness he felt was more from the situation than the temperature. As they neared the station's door, Marcus could see other officers inside, milling about their desks, chatting casually, unaware of, or perhaps indifferent to, what was about to happen. The moment they stepped inside, the fluorescent lights of the station cast a harsh glare over everything. Marcus blinked against the brightness, feeling a wave of nausea roll over him. He had seen the inside of police stations before, but always as a visitor, always in control. Now the tables were turned, and the sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. Harris and Stevens led Marcus through the station without a word, guiding him past rows of desks and into a dimly lit hallway that led to the holding area. The tension between them was palpable, and Marcus could feel the weight of their disdain with every step. It was clear that they didn't care who he was, didn't care about the truth of the situation. To them, he was just another black man who had stepped out of line. They stopped in front of a small, dingy room with a single metal bench bolted to the floor. Harris unlocked the door and motioned for Marcus to step inside. "Sit down," he ordered. Marcus complied, though his body felt stiff from the tension and the tightness of the cuffs. He lowered himself onto the cold metal bench, his mind still racing as he tried to figure out what would happen next. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but in situations like this, that didn't seem to matter. The door slammed shut behind him with a loud clang, and Marcus was left alone in the small room. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air heavy with the smell of stale sweat and disinfectant. He could hear the muffled sounds of the station outside, but none of it felt real. It was like he had stepped into some kind of nightmare, a surreal version of reality where justice didn't exist. Minutes passed, maybe hours, he wasn't sure. Time had lost all meaning in the sterile, suffocating space. All he could think about was Evelyn and Sophia. Were they okay? Did Evelyn get medical attention for her burns? Were they scared? The thought of them being alone, unprotected, made his chest tighten. He had always prided himself on being the rock for his family, but now he was helpless, trapped in this cell while the world continued on without him. Just as Marcus was beginning to lose track of how long he had been sitting there, the door swung open again. Harris and Stevens entered, but this time their expressions were different. They looked smug, like they had been waiting for this moment. "Get up," Harris barked. Marcus stood slowly, his muscles stiff from sitting in the uncomfortable position for so long. He tried to keep his face neutral, but inside, his frustration was mounting. What more could they want from him? They had already humiliated him, already dragged him through the station like a common criminal. Surely that was enough. But it wasn't. It never was. Before Marcus could ask what was happening, Harris stepped forward and, without warning, shoved him hard against the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of Marcus, his chest slamming against the cold, hard surface as Harris twisted his arm behind his back. "You think you're tough, huh?" Harris sneered, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can just walk around, acting like you're better than everyone else?" Marcus's heart raced, but he bit back the urge to respond. He knew that anything he said would only make things worse. He had seen this kind of abuse before, seen how quickly things could escalate when police felt threatened or disrespected. His only option now was to survive this, to get through it somehow. Stevens stepped in, adding to the assault by grabbing Marcus's other arm and pushing him down onto the floor. The rough concrete scraped against his knees, but he didn't cry out. He refused to give them the satisfaction of hearing him in pain. "You're a joke," Stevens spat, tightening the handcuffs around Marcus's wrists until they dug into his skin. "A black judge? Who do you think you're fooling? People like you don't belong in positions of power." Marcus's vision blurred as the pain intensified. His shoulders burned from the pressure of being twisted so violently, and his wrists felt like they were on the verge of breaking. But through it all, he remained silent, his jaw clenched tight as he endured the abuse. He had never felt more powerless in his life. Harris leaned down, his face inches from Marcus's ear. "You're not gonna get out of this," he whispered, his voice filled with venom. "People like you don't get second chances. You're done." Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of the precarious situation he was in. He had always believed in the system, always trusted that justice would prevail in the end. But now, faced with the brutal reality of his situation, he wasn't so sure. The two officers dragged Marcus back to his feet, shoving him toward the door. He stumbled, his legs weak from the pain, but he managed to keep his balance as they hauled him through the station once more. They were taking him to the booking area now, where his mugshot would be taken, his fingerprints collected, just like any other criminal. As they passed by the other officers, Marcus noticed the way they looked at him. Some glanced up briefly, disinterested, while others smirked, clearly enjoying the spectacle. None of them said a word. None of them offered to help. When they reached the booking area, Harris and Stevens roughly positioned Marcus in front of the camera. His wrists were still bound, his face bruised from the earlier assault, but they didn't care. They took his picture anyway, the flash of the camera searing his eyes as they captured his humiliation for the record. Once the photos were done, they led him to the fingerprint station, where a bored-looking officer mechanically rolled Marcus's fingers onto the ink pad and then onto the paper. The whole process felt like an out-of-body experience, like Marcus was watching it happen to someone else. But it was happening to him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they shoved him into a holding cell, slamming the door behind him with a resounding clang. Marcus stood in the middle of the small cell, his body aching, his mind reeling from everything that had happened. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, locked away, beaten, and treated like less than human. As he sat down on the cold metal bench, the weight of it all crashed down on him. He was a judge, a man who had devoted his life to justice. But in this moment, justice felt like a distant dream, something he could no longer reach. And then, for the first time since the ordeal began, Marcus allowed himself to feel the full depth of his despair. Hours had passed since Marcus was locked away in that cold, sterile cell. He sat on the hard bench, his hands still cuffed behind his back, the ache in his wrists now a dull, constant throb. The pain from the earlier beating was still fresh, his ribs sore, his shoulders stiff, but none of it compared to the emotional toll of the night. He couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn and Sophia, wondering if they were safe, if Evelyn had received any medical attention, if Sophia had stopped crying. The helplessness was suffocating, but there was nothing he could do. At some point during the long hours, Marcus had dozed off, his exhaustion finally catching up with him. But his sleep was restless, filled with images of the night's events, Evelyn's scream as the hot tea burned her face, the look of smug satisfaction on the man's face as Marcus was handcuffed, the cold, unfeeling expressions of the police officers who had arrested him. He awoke with a start, his body stiff and sore from the uncomfortable position he had slept in. The cell was still dark, illuminated only by a single flickering light overhead. For a moment, he wasn't sure what had woken him, but then he heard it, a faint, distant sound. It was muffled, but as Marcus strained to listen, it became clearer. Chanting. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the sound grew louder with each passing minute. It was rhythmic, growing stronger, more unified, as if a crowd were gathering outside. Marcus stood up slowly, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what was happening. A few minutes later, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by the familiar clanking of keys. Marcus stepped back instinctively as the cell door swung open and two officers entered. This time, they weren't Harris and Stevens. These officers looked uneasy, their expressions conflicted as they approached Marcus. "Get up," one of them said, though his voice lacked the hostility of the previous officers. Marcus didn't argue. He rose to his feet, his body stiff and aching from the long night, and allowed the officers to guide him out of the cell. As they walked him back through the station, Marcus realized that the chanting was coming from outside the building, and it wasn't just a small crowd. The voices were loud and powerful, unified in their message. As they approached the front entrance, Marcus was led to a small office where several other officers were gathered. The atmosphere was tense, with officers huddled around computer screens, murmuring to one another in low voices. Marcus could feel the unease in the room. It was clear that something had shifted. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a worn expression, looked up from his desk and gestured for Marcus to be seated. "Sit down, Judge Reed," he said, his tone surprisingly respectful. Marcus complied, though the tension in his chest remained. He had no idea what was happening, but the air of uncertainty around him made it clear that something big was unfolding. The officer glanced at the screen in front of him, then back at Marcus. "I assume you're not aware of the situation outside," he said, though it wasn't a question. Marcus shook his head. "I've been in a cell all night," he replied, his voice low but steady. "What's going on?" The officer sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "There's a protest outside, a big one." Marcus frowned, his mind trying to process the information. "A protest? Why?" The officer turned the computer screen toward Marcus, and in an instant, everything became clear. The video playing on the screen showed the restaurant where the incident had taken place. It was shaky, clearly recorded on a phone, but the footage was unmistakable. It captured the moment the man threw the hot tea on Evelyn, her scream of pain as the liquid scalded her face, and then Marcus rising to defend her. The video continued, showing the police arriving and arresting Marcus, the rough treatment he received at their hands, all while the real aggressor, the man who had attacked Evelyn, stood by, smirking. The video had gone viral. As Marcus watched in disbelief, he saw the number of views climb higher and higher. The video shared across multiple social media platforms. Thousands of comments filled the screen, most of them expressing outrage at what had happened. People were furious that a black man had been arrested for defending his family. Furious that the police had taken the word of a white man without question. Furious at the clear injustice of it all. The officer leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he watched Marcus's reaction. "The video started circulating a few hours ago," he explained. "Since then, the protest outside has been growing. People are demanding that you be released immediately. It's a mess." Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was out, that people could see what had really happened, but also anger that it had come to this. He shouldn't have had to rely on a viral video to prove his innocence. His word, his integrity, should have been enough. But it wasn't. Not in this system. Not as a black man. "What about the man who attacked my wife?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but laced with tension. "Has he been arrested?" The officer hesitated, glancing at his colleagues before answering. "Not yet," he admitted, "but we're working on it." Marcus clenched his jaw, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Of course, they hadn't arrested him. The man had walked away that night with nothing more than a bruised ego, while Marcus had been thrown into a cell, beaten and humiliated. And now, even with the video out in the open, the wheels of justice were moving painfully slow. "What about my wife?" Marcus asked, his voice softening as he thought of Evelyn. "Is she okay?" The officer nodded. "She was taken to the hospital after the incident. I believe she's recovering, but there will be scarring." Marcus closed his eyes, his heart heavy with guilt. He had failed to protect her, failed to shield her from the pain and suffering that this man had inflicted. And now, even though she was physically safe, the emotional and physical scars would remain with her for the rest of her life. Suddenly, the door to the office swung open, and a tall man in a suit strode in. His face was tense, his expression serious, and Marcus recognized him immediately. Chief Daniels, the head of the police department. He had met Daniels several times in the past, mostly at city events and judicial functions, but tonight, the dynamic between them was different. "Judge Reed," Daniels said, his voice strained. "We need to talk." Marcus nodded, though the tension in his chest remained. He could sense that something was about to happen, something that could change the course of the night. Daniels gestured toward the door. "Come with me," he said. We've got a situation on our hands." Marcus followed Daniels through the station, the officer from earlier trailing behind them. As they approached the front doors, the chanting from outside grew louder, more insistent. Marcus could hear the voices of the crowd, their demands for justice ringing out in unison. When they stepped outside, the scene that greeted Marcus was overwhelming. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of people had gathered outside the police station, holding signs, chanting slogans, demanding his release. The air was thick with the energy of the crowd, their voices a roar of defiance against the injustice they had witnessed. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. He had never seen anything like this before. So many people standing together fighting for him. It was humbling, overwhelming, and empowering all at once. Chief Daniels cleared his throat, drawing Marcus's attention back to him. "This has gotten out of control," he said, his voice low. "The public is demanding justice and, well, we can't ignore it anymore. I've spoken with the mayor and we've decided that you're free to go. The charges are being dropped." Marcus blinked, trying to process the words. "Free to go?" he repeated. Daniels nodded. "You shouldn't have been arrested in the first place. We've reviewed the video and it's clear that you were defending your wife. We're sorry for the mistake." Marcus felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge of everything that had already happened. The beating, the humiliation, the fact that his family had been left alone in their time of need, all of it could never be undone by a simple apology. "And the officers who arrested me?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but firm. "What's going to happen to them?" Daniels hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. "We're conducting an internal investigation," he said. "There will be consequences, I assure you." Marcus wasn't satisfied with the answer, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but at least now he was free to stand alongside his family and continue that fight. As Marcus stepped towards the crowd, the chanting grew louder, the voices of the protesters rising in a wave of support. He looked out at the sea of faces, people of all colors and backgrounds, standing together in solidarity. For the first time that night, Marcus allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. The crowd outside the police station had grown even larger by the time Marcus was released. News outlets had arrived, their cameras flashing, capturing the overwhelming support that had gathered in his name. As Marcus stepped out into the cold night air, flanked by Chief Daniels and the other officers, the energy from the crowd surged toward him, their chants filling the air with calls for justice. But even as the relief of his release washed over him, Marcus couldn't fully relax. Evelyn's face, burned, scarred, still haunted his thoughts. The injustice of it all, the sheer cruelty of the night's events, weighed heavily on him. No amount of public support or apologies could erase what had happened to her. As Marcus descended the steps of the police station, he was greeted by a wave of reporters, all of them clamoring for his attention. Microphones were thrust toward his face, cameras zooming in on every expression, every movement. But Marcus wasn't interested in talking to the media. His focus was on finding his family. He spotted Evelyn and Sophia standing near the edge of the crowd, shielded by a few friends who had come to support them. Evelyn's face was bandaged, the damage from the scalding tea still visible despite the layers of gauze. Sophia clung to her mother's side, her face pale and drawn from the stress of the night. Marcus pushed through the reporters, ignoring their questions and demands for a statement, and rushed to his wife and daughter. As soon as he reached them, he enveloped them both in a tight embrace, holding them close as if he could protect them from everything that had happened. "I'm so sorry," Marcus whispered into Evelyn's ear, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for all of this." Evelyn didn't speak right away, but her arms wrapped around him, holding him just as tightly. Sophia buried her face in Marcus's chest, her small body trembling with relief and exhaustion. "It's not your fault," Evelyn finally said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "None of this is your fault." But Marcus couldn't shake the guilt. He had been unable to prevent the assault on his wife, unable to stop the police from arresting him, unable to shield his family from the trauma they had endured. The weight of it all was almost unbearable. After a long moment, Marcus pulled back slightly, looking into Evelyn's eyes. "Did you get checked out? Are you okay?" Evelyn nodded slowly, though the pain in her eyes was clear. I'm okay. The burns, they'll leave scars, but I'll be fine." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Scars. Permanent reminders of the violence and hatred they had been subjected to that night. He wanted to scream, to demand justice for the suffering Evelyn had endured, but he knew that his anger wouldn't help her heal. Instead, he held her hand tightly, a silent promise that he would stand by her through whatever came next. Behind them, the crowd continued to chant, their voices a mixture of anger and determination. Protesters held up signs demanding justice, not just for Marcus, but for every black man and woman who had been wronged by the system. The video of his arrest had become a catalyst for something much larger than him, sparking outrage and calls for systemic change. As Marcus stood there with his family, Chief Daniels approached once more, his expression serious but uneasy. "Judge Reed," Daniels began, clearing his throat, "we've arrested the man who attacked your wife. He's being held on charges of assault and hate crimes. We'll be pursuing the maximum penalty." Marcus looked at Daniels, searching for any sign of sincerity in his words. There was an apology hidden in the chief's tone, a recognition of the failures of his department. But Marcus wasn't interested in apologies anymore. He wanted real justice. Justice for his wife, for himself, and for every black person who had been mistreated by the police. "And what about the officers who arrested me?" Marcus asked, his voice firm but calm. "The ones who beat me and refused to listen to the truth?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the scrutiny his department was under. "We've launched an internal investigation," he replied. "The officers involved have been placed on leave while we review the case. I can assure you there will be consequences." Marcus stared at him unblinking. "Consequences," he repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "Do you think that's enough? Do you think a slap on the wrist is enough for what they did to me, to my family?" Daniels swallowed hard, clearly caught off guard by Marcus's directness. "I understand your anger," he said, "but we have procedures we have to follow. I promise you this won't be swept under the rug." Marcus said nothing for a long moment, his eyes locked on Daniels's. He had heard promises like this before. Empty assurances meant to placate, to quiet the uproar. But this time, things felt different. The public outcry, the video that had gone viral, the protests outside the station, it was all too big to ignore. "See that it's not," Marcus finally said, his voice low and cold, "because if it is, I'll make sure everyone knows. I'll take this fight as far as it needs to go." Daniels nodded, understanding the weight behind Marcus's words. The chief turned and walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his family once more. The reporters were still swarming, but Marcus ignored them as he led Evelyn and Sophia to a quiet corner away from the crowd. They needed a moment to breathe, to gather themselves after the whirlwind of the last several hours. As they sat down together, Sophia finally spoke, her voice small and shaky. "Is it over, Dad?" Marcus sighed, looking at his daughter's tear-streaked face. "I don't know, sweetheart," he admitted, "but I promise you we're going to make sure something changes. This isn't going to happen again. Not to us, and not to anyone else." Evelyn squeezed his hand, a silent show of support. She was still in pain, still reeling from the attack, but her strength was undeniable. Marcus drew comfort from her presence, from the knowledge that they had survived this nightmare together. As they sat in the quiet corner, the roar of the crowd still echoing in the background, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a call from one of his colleagues or perhaps his lawyer, but what he saw instead made his heart skip a beat. It was a news alert, reporting that the video of his arrest had been picked up by major networks across the country. Headlines screamed for reform, for accountability. The public's outrage was spreading, and it was clear that this incident was no longer just about Marcus and his family. It had become a symbol of a much larger issue, one that had been festering for far too long. Marcus put the phone back in his pocket, his mind racing. He had always believed in the power of the law, in the system of justice that he had spent his life upholding. But tonight had shown him just how broken that system could be. how easily it could turn against the very people it was supposed to protect. But now, with the world watching, maybe, just maybe, things would start to change. He looked at Evelyn, her face still bandaged, and then at Sophia, who had finally stopped crying, though her eyes were still filled with fear. "I promise you both," Marcus said softly, his voice filled with determination, "this isn't the end. We're going to fight, and we're going to win." Evelyn nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know," she whispered. "We're stronger than they think." As the crowd outside the police station continued to chant for justice, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The scars from that night, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. But they would fight for justice, not just for themselves, but for every person who had been wronged by the system. And this time, they wouldn't stop until real change came. This is only the beginning. Want to know how this fight for justice unfolds? Make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories to life. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on how we can fight for justice together.